Welcome to today's webinar, Accelerating Network Operations with Big Cloud Fabric's Single Pane of Glass, Session 1 Overview. My name is Sharon Fitzpatrick and I will be your host for today's webinar. As we go through the presentation, please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A box on your webinar dashboard. If you're watching this video on demand and you have a question regarding today's topic, simply go to bigswitch.com/webinars and submit a question using the link provided. We have also provided you with handouts for today's session. The Big Cloud Fabric data sheet plus information on Big Switch Labs is available via the webinar dashboard. You can download them from the Handouts tab, which is in the right-hand corner of your dashboard. Joining me today is Katie Shapiro, Technical Marketing Engineer, and Cedric Hobbs, GUI Architect, Big Switch Networks. We have a full agenda for today's webinar. Let's get started.
Okay, great. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. Great to be here. So let's start talking about next generation data center switching. Next slide, please. So why are we here? If you think about today's data center, there's a lot of change happening. You've probably heard that before. The rise of cloud-native applications, containers, virtualization, lots of east-west traffic, and traditional networking is just not cutting it. It's complex and it's slow. If you look at where the networking is today still, you're talking a lot about box-by-box operations. Yes, a lot of innovations has happened in the past. Management, things like that has been built on top, or should I say bolted on. But in the end, the network today is still as it was many, many years ago, right? You have lots of boxes. Each box has lots of protocols running on them, and you have to configure things box by box by box. And likewise, you have to troubleshoot things box by box, right? So if you look at this, really how you configure the network, how you troubleshoot it, is almost like we've done it in the 1990s, right? We used to have some CLIs, we still have some CLIs, and guess what? We may have some REST APIs. But really, there hasn't been any fundamental change. And as a result, the network really has become very brittle and very opaque. Right? So trying to do any change management, trying to bring in new applications, new workloads, really takes quite a bit of time. Right? So clearly, network has become a barrier. And the question is, what do we do? So as I said, right, legacy networking, very box-driven, very feature-driven. Vendors typically compete on either features or speed and feeds. And what Big Switch Networks is after is really looking at the next generation networking, which is, unlike being feature-driven or speed and feeds-driven, is intent-driven. If you think about driving a vehicle, you never expect to be kind of operating the entire engine or knowing the ins and outs of what's happening under the hood. You just expect to press on the gas and go. And when you press on the pedal, you expect to stop. Likewise with the network. Why isn't that we cannot express the intent, such as, I just want to add a switch and not have to do 5 or 10 different commands to do that? Or I just want to add a server and have that immediately communicate with my fabric. That is the concept of the intent-driven provisioning, intent-driven operations that Big Switch's Big Cloud Fabric embodies. So let's look at the Big Cloud Fabric in a little more detail. So Big Cloud Fabric is a leaf-spine network that's built based on an SDN controller from Big Switch Networks and open networking switches that are running switch-like operating system. It is an integrated layer 2 and layer 3 fabric with distributed logical routing running at the leaf layer. Big Cloud Fabric Controller is a single point of integration with orchestration tools like VMware, OpenStack, and containers. And in terms of our open networking switches, we're working with various vendors, in this case, such as Dell EMC or Acton, and of course, a myriad of server partners and application partners that we work with. Okay. Now, how do we configure this fabric? The controller is a single point of access to the fabric. As I mentioned in the first slide, we don't do box by box. if you log into our switches, you will not be able to do anything. You will not be able to do any show commands. You will not be able to configure anything, because the premise of this product is really about having a single pane of glass for configuration and for troubleshooting. Now, when accessing the SDN controller, we can access it via CLI, and we have a fully featured industry standard CLI, GUI, and REST API, all of which have quite a bit of feature parity between each other. So we have a lot of customers, some of them are like in CLI, they might be starting with a CLI, but as they look at our GUI, which is the topic of our discussion, they're really starting to embrace the GUI as their day-to-day management and troubleshooting method. A couple of examples of our GUI, and we'll get into this more during the demo that Cedric will show. Nice dashboards that we have that are showing you the view of the entire fabric. Again, from an operations and visibility standpoint, you never have to log into a single switch. There is no workflow that's really switch-based for you to get some information. And visualizing fabric topology really helps you see the health and the state of your network. Right? Seeing all of your leaf switches, spine switches, and in the case of if you're using OpenStack or containers, looking at the vSwitches. Right? So one of the solutions that we have for this fabric is a physical network only that we use for bare metal workloads, or also when we integrate with VMware. And we also have a physical plus virtual solution that we use with OpenStack and containers. In that case, we're actually providing a virtual switch, and we're able to visualize both the physical and the virtual part of the network. Okay. Now, a common question that you may get is, I've seen GUIs before, and what you're telling me is maybe nothing new. Right? How is the Big Cloud Fabric GUI really different? Now, if you think about typical networking GUIs, graphical user interfaces, even though it tries to simplify things and it tries to basically kind of aggregate and present you a single pane of glass, GUIs are usually bolted on. They have been designed after the fact, and as such, there's still a lot of box-by-box management. Right? There is always going to be a time when you have to either log into individual box or you have some GUI workflow that is really pertinent to that specific box. CLI and GUI feature gap is very common, again, because GUIs in a networking world are usually an afterthought versus with Big Cloud Fabric, where GUI is an integral part of the product. The other thing is ability to process or display the large quantities of data. And one of the reasons why in the past networking admins really have not embraced GUIs is whenever they're doing troubleshooting or they're looking at hundreds of VLANs, they have just found GUI to be able, not be able to handle it. Right? And then troubleshooting tools. Right? When folks are troubleshooting networks, they're just used to their show commands, they're used to trace routes, they're used to pings. They haven't had the kind of capabilities that we're providing here in the Big Cloud Fabric GUI. Right? Now, compare that with the Big Cloud Fabric GUI. Single pane of glass management, as I said, we're logging into or we're managing the controller, and the controller manages the entire fabric. Fully featured, and so parity between CLI and GUI that we have over here, and rich data visualization and analytics that are showing you both real-time visibility and also historical visibility. Okay. And finally, we talked about the intent-based networking. Big Cloud Fabric GUI really embodies the intent-based networking concepts that we have. Right? As I said, when we're talking about adding a switch, when we're talking about provisioning a new workload, really it's based on what I want to do, not how I should be doing it. Okay. So in summary, the Big Cloud Fabric GUI speeds up your operations. When you're doing network provisioning, you don't have to do box by box. You manage the entire fabric as a single pane of glass, as one big switch, hence the name of the company, Big Switch Networks. We simplify management, and as a result of this, we lower the OpEx. So with this, I'll hand it off to Cedric, who is the GUI architect and the brain behind the Big Cloud Fabric GUI. Cedric?
Great. Thank you, Arkady, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone who's watching today's webinar. I'm really excited to talk about some of the features in our Big Cloud Fabric GUI, and today I'll be giving a very cursory overview of some of the major content areas in the BCF GUI. paying particular attention to how users can navigate and manage content. The next two sessions will explore some of our more exciting graphical interfaces for managing the fabric. And our final session will explore some troubleshooting scenarios, highlighting the killer test path tool available in BCF.
In order to use the GUI, simply point your favorite browser to the IP address of one of the controller nodes, preferably the active node. Enter your credentials and click the login button or hit enter on your keyboard. And you'll be taken to the home page, which is a dashboard. There's lots of content here and some options, so I'll talk about those. Let's actually start with the day-night mode. By default, we're in the light mode, where the background is white, but I can click this button to toggle to the dark display. So this would be good for displaying the dashboard in a NOC somewhere, or if you're in some other low light environment. You also notice that the charts are in a particular color theme with red, orange, yellow, green, gray, and brown. I can change the selected color theme. There's 17 other available ones to choose from, 18 total. I'm going to choose page. And you'll see that now all the charts, aside from the heat maps, have been redrawn in the new color theme. I can use the refresh button at the upper left to refresh each panel. And when I do that, each panel dims until its data is ready and it's been re-rendered. Or I can configure an auto refresh interval by clicking this button. And let's do 60 seconds. Once I configure this refresh interval, you'll see that there's a sweeper bar in the timer button itself that starts to rotate like a large pie slice that keeps expanding. And this is really a countdown of when the next refresh will happen. So this is a good visual indicator of how close you are to the next refresh. And now there's also a pause button, so I can pause that auto refresh. So when I click this, the sweeper bar will stop expanding, which means no auto refresh will happen, and then until I unpause it, and then the sweeper bar will resume. I can also change the layout of the content. The content is arranged in rows, so there's 5 different rows, which is 5 different sort of high-level sections of content. And I can change the order by clicking these buttons, or I can turn an entire row on or off by clicking these toggles. Now each panel is also individually refreshable. I can click the refresh button in the panel itself to refresh its content. And you'll notice that the content itself is really, at the top we have some attributes about the controller, the IP addresses, the controller version and uptime, and inventory about the BCF configuration. And then there's also some stats on the controller nodes themselves, CPU, memory, disk usage, etc. And the next 2 rows, like I mentioned, are the 3D heat maps for switch performance, memory utilization, and CPU load. And each of these is configurable. You can choose which switches to include by role. You can choose some cosmetic details about the chart itself, and in the case of the CPU load, you can change the time range over which the CPU load is averaged. And the last 3 plots are essentially rates and counters. So we look at the top 5 segments, the top 5 tenants, and the top 5 interfaces in terms of the rates and counters. So let's start looking at the physical layer in our BCF installation here. I'm going to go under the Fabric menu and click Switches. So there's a couple of sections of content up here that I'm going to collapse for now because they're out of scope. But what we're left with is mostly a table of switches. And I want to talk a little bit about the tables just because they're used in a lot of places in the GUI, and there's a lot of good functionality that folks might want to know about. At the top, there's options and controls that really affect the corpus of data, that affect all rows. So for example, there's a table menu, which will have usually a menu item like show hide columns, which when clicked will pop up a dialog of all the columns that are available. You can see that for the switches table, there's just a ton of columns, and we don't show them all by default. But we leave it to the user to select the columns in which he or she is interested in. And I'm going to add, let's see, serial number. I've already removed some columns that were taking up some space here. Let's add admin status and save. If the user is allowed to add items to the table, there's a plus button for adding an item. In this case, for switches, it's provisioning a switch configuration. There's a refresh button that you can use to refresh all the data, and an export button to export the data in the table in either JSON or CSV format. And then there's a filter bar at the top, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Each row also has some functionality. You'll see a row menu, which will have some sort of built-in system things, possibly like edit or delete, but then also it can have support custom menu items, like in this case for switches, you can do custom switch-related behavior like shutdown or reboot or beacon. And many rows also have content that actually doesn't fit neatly into another column, usually other tables. So in this case, a switch has a table of interfaces, fabric lags, links, and for leaf switches, also a table of leaf group peers. There's also pagination. In this case, we have 46 total switches, and we're only showing 25 at a time. I can show them all by clicking 100 switches, 100 items per page, or go back to 25. And when I have, when my set of rows exceeds the number here in the page size, then pagination is triggered, and I can cycle through the different pages of the content. Sorting is as you would expect. You can click a column header to sort. It's important to note that each column is typed. So a column can be a string or a number or a Boolean, and that affects the sorting primarily. So if we sort a string column, it's sorted lexically. And if we sort a numerical column like port, it's sorted numerically. Now, in some cases, the string column will be sensitive to numbers inside the string. So if you have things numbered spine 1, spine 2, spine 3, all the way up to spine 10, if it's sorted purely lexically, spine 10 would come before spine 9. But if we actually are sensitive to numbers in there, you'll get it in the order that you would expect, 1 through 10. Let's also talk a little bit about filtering. Let's suppose I want to look at, I want to see all my leaf switches. As a first pass, I could always sort of just sort by the column I'm interested in. In this case, the leaf switches are at the top, but that might not always be the case. So this is where filtering comes in. So I want to look for leaf switches. So let's just enter leaf in the filter box and see what happens. I'll hit enter, and voila, I've got leaf switches. So the problem with this sort of filter term is that it's looking for the word leaf in every column of the table, even the ones that are hidden. So if a spine switch, for example, just happened to have leaf in its description, it would turn up in these results too. So what you might really want is a more targeted way of filtering. I want to look for any row where fabric role is leaf, or where this leaf column is a checkbox. So let's clear that out, and I can open now my advanced query builder, and I can pick the column I'm interested in, and I can enter a value. I want fabric role to be leaf. You notice the comparison can be is, contains, starts with, or ends with. And if the column is a number, these comparisons change to equals, greater than, less than. And if it's a Boolean, there's different comparisons too. You just decide if it's true or false. So I can do it that way, close and filter, or I can do it, use the leaf Boolean column where leaf is true, and I'll get the exact same result. You notice that if I did it the other way with the fabric role column, it's case insensitive. So it doesn't matter if I use uppercase or lowercase leaf. So that's cool way of getting to sub-content that I'm interested in. But it's also still a little bit tedious. I've got to open up this dialog and click drop-downs and enter text. So a better way to do this is just through the table itself. You'll notice as I mouse over different cells in the table that there's a little button that keeps popping up inside the cells. And if I mouse over that button, it says add filter for this exact value. So this is a clue that this is a shortcut for filtering my set of data. So let's try it. If I mouse over the fabric roll leaf cell and click this button, we'll automatically add the column-specific filter term in the filter box. And so in this way, I can actually drill down. If I do it again, it's just going to add to the existing filter terms. So suppose I want all leaf switches in leaf group rack 3. I can just find my rack 3 row here, cell here, and click this again, and now I've compounded my filter terms. So I've gotten this, very targeted subset of data in 2 clicks, without having to open up a dialog or type anything. So I'm going to clear the filters, and let's talk about the switch detail pages. So right now we're looking at a table of switches, and it has some interesting information, but there's a lot more content that we might be interested in on switches. So you'll notice that the name is a link, and if I click that, let's pick this one. If I click that link, I'll pick this one and go to a leaf detail page. You'll see that there's a lot more content here. The first thing that will pop out to you is the detailed drawing of the switch itself. This drawing is faithful to the actual hardware that it's on. So this leaf switch is a Dell S4000, and so this is a Dell S4000 drawing with all the ports and LEDs and system LEDs drawn the way it would appear on the actual hardware switch, the actual physical switch. So the goal of this is to represent the switch in a way that helps you avoid making trips to your data center all the time. And this graphic can be toggled. You can look at the front or the back by clicking this button here. And the back will have fans and TSUs that also have LEDs. And you can also trigger or toggle the view itself. If I'm interested in seeing it head-on versus a projected view, I can toggle that here. So the content below that is in tabs. So the first tab is a diagnostic tab, which is going to have some errors and warnings. And these are farmed from the fabric errors and warnings that DCF provides in a global way. So we can go through all those warnings and look for any warnings that apply to this particular switch and gather them here. And there's also other warnings that are derived from the environment and things like that. For example, I'll show you in another tab where we have some status on the fans in the back. And if they're not all blowing in the same direction, we add a warning here. That's not in the fabric errors or warning. There's a tab of properties, which is essentially some of the basic information that you saw in the switches table itself. There's a tab of actions, and these actions match the menu items you saw in the row menus for each switch row in the switches table. There is a table of interface counters, and this is distinct from the interfaces tab over here, just because there's so many additional columns for these interfaces. We just split it out into a separate table of counters. So this is all the interfaces on that switch. It's their counters and timestamps. And if I skip over here to this other interfaces tab, this is the same interfaces but with different columns. I can click on the environment tab to see information about fans, sensors, and power supply units. And then there's additional tabs like links and lags. In the case of a leaf switch, I have additional tabs for the connected virtual switches, the leaf group that it's a member of, and any interface groups that are configured on that switch. And finally, we have a tab of S-flow counters and a button to reset those counters. So real quickly, I'm going to go to the interfaces table. Now, this is a table of interfaces across all switches. And I'm just going to use this to demonstrate a sort of a filter and locate workflow. I know that there's a switch in this system that has some breakout ports. some breakout cables enabled on it, but I can't remember which ones. And I know that there's a naming convention for logical ports from a breakout cable, and I know they always contain a colon in them. So I'm going to do a targeted search. I'm going to look for interface names that contain a colon. So now I get 8 logical ports, which represent 2 physical ports. So this tells me that Ethernet 27 and Ethernet 28 on spine 1 have been broken out into 4 logical ports. So I'm going to click this switch detail page, a link to get to the switch detail page. And now I see by the way, this is a different graphic. This is an Acton AS6700, and the graphic is quite different, and it matches the hardware of that particular switch. But what I wanted to point out was that these ports actually have little triangles in the upper left to indicate that they have breakout cables in them. And if I mouse over, I'll actually see the tooltips for each logical port rather than for the physical port. So now let's talk about interface groups. I touched on those briefly. That was some of the tabbed content on the leaf switches. An interface group is simply a collection of ports. It can span multiple switches as long as those switches are in the same leaf group. So by definition, they can only be defined on leaf switches in the same leaf group. And a leaf group can only have up to 2 switches, so really it's confined to 1 or 2 switches. So if I decide to create a new interface group, and I'm just going to give it a temporary name here, there's some optional fields like description. We're going to leave the mode alone. Static is the default. The rest of those are out of scope, but static is the standard one. If I give it a name and a mode, and I select the leaf group on which I want to define that interface group, and then I'm suddenly presented with a graphical layout of the switches in that leaf group. I'm going to pick another one that has more content. Right, so I see all these interfaces sort of laid out. Some are grayed out because they're already members of an interface group. So now I'm presented with only those interfaces that I'm allowed to use in an interface group. So I can select an interface to be a member of this interface group. And you notice as I keep clicking, I'm toggling between these 2 buckets over here. So the first click puts it in the primary members bucket. The second click puts it in the backup members bucket. And then the third click clears it. So I can sort of cycle through the different options. Or I can just drag the interface to the bucket I'm interested in. So I can keep clicking as many as I want until I get to some limit. And I'm going to demonstrate just some validation here. That after my 16th one, if I try to click a 17th one, now there's a validation message saying I can only add up to 16. So I have to clear that out. And then I can save my interface group. So that's a really cool graphical way of defining interface groups or lags or what have you. So let's now take a look at the logical layer. As I navigate to the tenants page, let me just define some terms here. A tenant defines a logical layer 2 and layer 3 network connecting a group of devices or services. A segment is a logical layer 2 network within a tenant, similar to a VLAN. Now, traffic within a segment is isolated by default, but the tenant can be configured via its logical router to route traffic between its segments or to external networks. And the endpoints are the devices or services configured or learned on a particular segment. And the segment membership rules define the set of physical interfaces on which an endpoint may be learned or configured. So now we're looking at a table of tenants. You can see that there's a bunch already configured here on this system. And if I wanted to create a tenant, I would just give it a name and some other optional attributes and be done. There's a lot more configuration to do on a tenant, but to do that, you have to sort of drill down to the detail pages and do it incrementally. There's just too much to fit in one dialog. So let's look at one tenant. Let's look at OS management. If I expand the auxiliary content, I'll see a couple of tables, a few tables of content, some logical router properties, any configured routes, and the logical segments that are already defined on that tenant. So in this case, we see there's already 5 logical segments. And if I want to see even more content, I need to click on the tenant name and go to the tenant detail page, where I'll see a much richer list of content. So here we see things like stats and the tenant properties, any multicast information, logical router properties, BGP configuration and state, etc. But what I'm really interested in right now is the logical segments. So we're looking at this table of logical segments again, and we can see that there's some membership rules defined on each of these segments. And we see some information about the state and the traffic classes, etc., but not a whole lot. So we need to drill down even more to the segment detail page. So now we're looking at an even deeper detail page for the segment EX defined on tenant OS management. And again, we see some charts for the traffic on that segment. And then we also see a table of membership rules, or 2 tables of membership rules for that segment. So one type of membership rule applies to interface groups, and the other applies to individual switch ports. So in this case, segment EX is looking at any interface group where the traffic is on VLAN 4001, and then it's also looking at any individual switch port where the traffic is on VLAN 4001. It's also looking at any untagged traffic on any switch where the interface name is one of these 5 values, E1, E3, E4, E5, EX4001. So this defines where endpoints can be learned or configured. And if I close those up and scroll down to endpoints, I can see that there are 7 endpoints known for this segment. And if you look at the attached points here, the switch interface, interface group, VLAN, they all match the membership rules that we looked at above. So they're all either on an interface group with VLAN 4001 or on an interface named E1 on any switch that's untagged traffic. So this is just a cursory look. We can see the hierarchy from the top level, from tenants down to segments, down to endpoints and some of the membership rules. It's also valuable to look at, to sort of explode that hierarchy. I want to sort of flip it upside down sometimes and maybe look at all the segments or all the endpoints. So we can do that here from the top level segments page. Now from here, we're looking at all the segments across all the tenants. The reason why you might want to do this is so you can do some filtering or sorting or other operations on your data. Maybe I want to see all the segments with membership rules configured, for example. So I might say, well, there's interface group member rules is not equal to 0, for example. So this query here is going to look for every segment that has at least one membership rule. Right, so there's my set of segments that actually have membership rules configured. So I can do some operations like that on my corpus of segments. Similarly, I might want to look at all the endpoints across all the segments, across all the tenants in my system. So from here, I can go to the endpoints page and look at all the endpoints. So in this case, we have about 97 endpoints defined in the system. And in this case, they're all labeled by segment or tenant. We can see all the attached points, any IP addresses associated with those learned endpoints. We even have a vendor prefix for a vendor name for each endpoint. And the vendor column is actually derived from the prefix in the MAC address, the first 6 characters. And so that actually makes it handy to search for specific hardware. If I want to look for all my Dell equipment in the system, I can just filter on Dell, and I can see all the endpoints that have MAC addresses that correspond to a Dell prefix.
So that concludes the first overview of the BCF GUI. I hope it gives folks just a taste of the content in BCF and whets some appetites for the upcoming sessions. And now I'll turn it back over to Sharon.
Thank you so much, Cedric. We've got a couple of questions for you. Is the GUI completely HTML5 based?
Yes, it is.
And we have another question, perhaps, Arkady, this might be good for you, can we talk a little bit about the analytics and how that is handled? Is it on the back end? How do we access that?
Sure. So great question. So we talked a lot about kind of the real-time visibility and all the data visualization. So Cedric kind of went over that. As part of the Big Cloud Fabric, we also have a historical analytics engine, which really helps you with addressing questions like, hey, I've had an outage last night, but really what's been happening on my network? And so those are the questions that we can answer with the historical analytics. That is part of the product. We have lots of videos and content about it on the Big Switch website, and future sessions will cover that in more detail. Definitely something that's there. Great part of the product and part of the GUI that's built on the Elastic, Logstash, and Kibana stack, and we're continuing to evolve that and develop it as we get more requirements from customers.
Perfect. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A dashboard. We'll be glad to share them with you. I think one of the questions is, do you show the physical typology? And I think we did that already. If you feel we haven't answered that, please let us know. There's also been a lot of questions in chat that we've been answering to all, so you can see them as well. We'll give it a minute, and if we don't hear anything, then I'm going to start the wrap-up for today's event. We have another question. Why do you use routing on the edge?
So the question is, why do you use routing on the edge? I'm not sure I fully understand it. Maybe Edward can try to restate the question.
That would be great. Edward, if you could do that, that would be great. We also just want to make sure that you saw there was an interesting question that Arkady answered. There are smart switches you are configured with or some sort of appliance running an SDN. That was a question, and that's definitely been answered. So Edward has kind of clarified a bit. He said, I saw routes and I thought you used OpenFlow. Is that a little clearer?
Say that again, Sharon. I didn't see the...
I saw routes and I thought you used OpenFlow. We can actually take that offline, Edward, if you'd like. He'll follow up directly with you. So at this point, I'm going to, at this time, let's do the wrap up, and we have no more questions at this time. So we are running short on time, so I want to wrap it up. And if there's something here that we discussed that you piqued your interest or you would like to know more, just head on over to bigswitch.com, or you can send us an email at info@bigswitch.com. Next slide, please. We make it easy for you to get started with Big Switch solutions. Next slide, please. There are several resources you can download, or watch a tour of our products anywhere on our website. With BSN Labs, you can experience Big Switch Network's open networking SDN solutions firsthand from the comfort of your PC. We believe there is no better way to learn about a product or technology than to take it for a test drive. For a free hands-on experience with our SDN Fabric products, please visit labs.bigswitch.com to get access. And also a reminder that we do have a handout explaining Big Switch Labs and how to try it for free in your dashboard. Next, please. All our past webinars, including this one, will be posted at bigswitch.com/webinars. We have 2 upcoming webinars. The first is on Tuesday, April 18th at 10 a.m. Pacific, and is a special edition SDX Central webinar. The title is Quantifying the Economic Advantages of Open Architecture NFV Designs. And a second webinar is scheduled for April 26th at 10 a.m. with our partner Red Hat, and is titled Production Ready Container Networking with Red Hat and Big Switch. You will find registration links for each of these webinars in your email. That concludes our presentation for today, and we want to thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time, and have a great rest of your day.